Awesome. Let's see if this is on. Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Mission May seminar. If you are in the foyer, please make your way in. There are some front row seats with your names on them. I've been looking forward to this event for a while, so it's awesome to see all your faces here. We have the privilege tonight of hearing from our guest speaker, Ben Smart, on the life and legacy of Elizabeth Elliot. Ben is married to Alex. They have 3 kids. Ben studied theology in Canada, which is where he met his wife, which is cool. And at the moment, they have moved to Perth, and he works as a senior staff member at UWA with the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students. If you would like to hear more about Ben and what he's up to, where he's been, then do come along to our evening service tomorrow, where I'll be grilling him some more. This is not Ben's first rodeo with these missional biographies. He has done a few before, and I have had the chance to hear them, one at a conference that I was at, and another at his home church. I've always found them quite gripping, and it's left me quite challenged in the way that I hear other Christians following Christ with their lives. And I do think that it's a disservice to ourselves to not listen to and to hear from faithful Christians who have gone before us, because I think we have a lot to learn from them. So that's what makes tonight exciting. The evening will be split into 2 parts, and we're going to have a 30-minute dessert intermission in the middle, which is not very long, so please don't dawdle in here, but make your way out there and get yourself some of the yummy things that have been made for us, and I'll give you a warning to come back in. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ben Smart on the life and legacy of Elizabeth Elliot. Thank you.
Thanks heaps, Rachel. Well, good day, everyone. It's great to be with you here as part of your annual Missions Month as we look at the life and legacy of Elizabeth Elliot. Quick show of hands, who'd heard of Elizabeth Elliot before, I guess, the lead up to this? So a decent number of people. Reading missionary biographies has had a really powerful influence in my own walk with God, a great source of encouragement for me, both in stirring my heart to love Jesus more in all of life, but also in the particular area of global missions and what it might look like for me to play a role in that. And so reading those kind of books has always been a great encouragement to me. And I know some people are readers, some people aren't, and that's okay. But I just started to think, what is a way that I could share some of this great source of blessing with others as well? And so it was from that 6 years ago at my church, St. Matthew's in Shenton Park, we hosted a biographical evening sharing about the life and legacy of a missionary that God had used. And we've ended up doing one every year since then. And so it's a really great joy to be here with you at North Beach and be able to share some of that we can look at together as well. Hebrews 13, 7-8 says, "Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever." You know, the New Testament talks quite a lot. The Apostle Paul often talks about following his example as he follows the example of Christ, of modeling our present-day leaders. But notice that Hebrews 13 isn't talking about present-day Christians. It's saying, remember them who spoke, past tense, the word of God to you. People who have perhaps already died, who we can look back on, see the way they lived, and allow their example to point us to Jesus, the same Jesus who was living and reigning and working through them, who's also living and reigning and working today. And so that's our goal tonight as we think about Elizabeth Elliot, not to just learn details about her life out of interest or curiosity or as a history lesson, but rather to consider her way of life and, where appropriate, to imitate her faith. She's not perfect. She's a sinner just like you and me. but there are many ways in which she followed Jesus faithfully and that I'm certainly challenged by and I think we can learn from together. So let's jump into the life of Elizabeth Elliot. Now, long before her last name was Elliot, she was Elizabeth Howard, born in 1926 in Belgium to missionary parents who were serving there with the Belgian Gospel Mission. When she was just 5 months old, her parents had to return to the US, and so she grew up for most of her life in Pennsylvania, along with her 4 brothers and 1 sister. And although her parents were no longer on the mission field themselves, the Howard home was always open to missionaries and visiting Christian speakers, which meant that from a young age, Elizabeth was exposed to the idea of cross-cultural missions. Her parents were still very involved in the missionary community, and often when a missionary was home on furlough or that kind of thing, they would stay in their home. And so the visiting missionaries at the dinner table would often regale Elizabeth and her siblings with these stories. Elizabeth Elliot shares from early life, from memories about Russell Abel, a missionary in the South Pacific, telling them about stories of having to flee from cannibals. Of L.L. Lecters telling them about coming into contact with a remote Indian tribe in Mexico that no one from the outside world had even known had existed before they found them. Or a single woman, Helen Yost, a missionary to American Indians, who opened Elizabeth's eyes from a young age to the importance of Bible translation work. So it wasn't just thrilling stories of adventure, though, that these missionaries were going out and having. It was also the hardships of the mission life that Elizabeth was very well aware of from an early age. One of the missionaries that Elizabeth met one day at the dinner table was Betty Stam, a missionary to China with her husband John. She met her, and then they had conversations, got to know each other. And so when John and Betty went back to China, they would regularly receive their prayer updates. Much like we get prayer emails today, they would get regular updates from Betty Stam and be praying for her. But one day they received some shocking news. They were informed by the mission agency that they wouldn't be receiving any more prayer updates from John and Betty Stam because they had been captured by communist forces, marched through the streets, and beheaded. Now, if you receive updates from mission partners in the field around the world today, imagine someone you know that happening to them. Imagine how shocking that would be. Not just a statistic or something that happened on the other side of the world in a news headline, but this is someone that you've met, that you know. And so from early on, young Elizabeth had a keen awareness of both the highs and lows of being a missionary. Both the great need to take the gospel to those who hadn't heard it, but also the very real cost that many faced for doing so. A few years later, a biography of Betty Stam was published, and it had a strong impact on young Elizabeth when she read it. She came across a passage where Betty had written this prayer in her journal a few years before she died. Lord, I give up all my own plans and purposes, all my own desires and hopes, and accept your will for my life. I give myself, my life, my all, utterly to you, to be yours forever. Fill me and seal me with your Holy Spirit. Use me as you will. Work out your whole will in my life at any cost, now and forever. It's quite a powerful prayer, isn't it? It's one that Elizabeth copied in the front of her Bible and read often, committing herself and her whole life to God in that same way. It's a powerful prayer, but also quite a scary one, isn't it? Asking God to use us however He will, our whole life for His purpose, whatever the cost. Is that a prayer I'm really willing to pray? I mean, it's easy to just mouth the words, but as you think about it, is that a prayer that you could pray to God? To ask Him to use you whatever the cost might be? And I wonder, imagine if we today had the boldness to pray that kind of prayer, I wonder how God might answer it in the lives of each one of us, even here in this room right now. Well, he certainly answered that prayer for young Elizabeth, and He would use her powerfully throughout her life, even at great cost. After she finished high school, Elizabeth went to Wheaton College, where she enrolled in a pre-medical degree, thinking that medicine would be useful on the mission field. She was already thinking that she wanted to go. But as time went on, she felt a steady pull towards translation work, wanting to put the Bible in more languages. So she ended up switching from medicine to Greek. And it was here at Wheaton that Elizabeth first met a young man named Jim Elliot. And Jim was a fellow student and head of the Foreign Missions Fellowship, a group of students who were seriously considering cross-cultural ministry. And in her final year at Wheaton College, the two of them had almost identical class schedules. They were both taking ancient Greek, Thucydides, Herodotus, and Septuagint, and soon they ended up finding themselves studying Greek together every evening. It actually reminds me a little bit of how Alex and I got to know each other back in Bible college. Rachel mentioned that we met each other there. Alex is actually 1 year above me in college, so she was my tutor in Greek, so she would mark the quizzes for our class, which was quite convenient because I'd write her little love notes in Greek that she would get. But then our professor, Dr. Reynolds, he had to check just to make sure everything was right, and so he called me aside one day in the hallway and said, "Ben, stop writing me love notes on those quizzes." So Wheaton, Jim and Elizabeth were spending a lot of time together, and they discovered that they shared a lot in common. And not just a love of Greek, but of course their enjoyment of Greek was always with a goal, with a purpose. It was so that they could know the original language in which the Bible was written in, so that they could translate it into new languages, to share the gospel with people. They both had a passion for the spread of the gospel in cross-cultural mission work. But this isn't your typical romance story, because another thing that they both had in common is that they both had a strong conviction that each of them wanted to go to the mission field single. They'd both come to this conviction independently of each other. And you can see this in their journals if you go back and read them. Elizabeth got there based on 1 Corinthians 7, which says, the Apostle Paul writing says this, "I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord." Now, this passage shows that Christians are free to marry. Paul's saying, I'm not writing this to restrict you. It's not a command. But simply what Paul is saying is that choosing to remain single can allow a person to have their focus and their undivided attention on serving the Lord, especially in a difficult place like on the mission field. Now, Jim had come to the same conviction, and for him, Matthew 19 was a key verse in him arriving there. In Matthew 19, Jesus is teaching on marriage, and he mentions those who have renounced the marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. After attending a missions conference, he wrote to Elizabeth, "Tribal work in the South American jungle is the general direction of my missionary purpose. Also, I'm confident that God wants me to begin jungle work single. My decision was based on seeing a man from central Brazilian jungles, who was visiting this conference and speaking at it, who had done a work comparable to the sort that I feel exercised for." He means the kind of work that I want to do in the future. He told of the impossibility of marriage in his particular context. "I will not say God is leading to me a life of celibacy, of lifelong singleness. I only know what I need to know for now, and that is that the Lord does not want me seeking a wife." He means at this point. And so, shortly before Elizabeth graduated, they decided that although they shared much in common and even had strong feelings for each other, they would not pursue a relationship. It was a very difficult decision for them both. Elizabeth wrote about this a lot in her journals, but at one point she writes, "Strange that two should have their whole patterns of thinking so intermingled. Has God allowed this as a test of our stand with him for a single life?" And so, with that, they went their separate ways. She went off for further studies in Oklahoma and then in Canada for the mission field, specializing in translation work, and he stayed on at Wheaton for further studies. They did decide to keep up regular correspondence by letter, though, and would do so for the next 3 years before each of them ended up leaving for the mission field pretty close in time to each other. And those 3 years were a time of preparation for Elizabeth. After Wheaton, she did postgraduate studies at Prairie Bible Institute, that's in Canada, as well as doing intensive linguistics training with Wycliffe. But even after all that, she still didn't go straight into the mission field. Instead, she wanted to stay in North America to do 2 things. Firstly, she wanted to take time to discern where God might want her. There were opportunities to go as a missionary to Africa, the South Pacific, South America, China, other places, and in fact, she knew missionaries in all of those places. And instead of rushing into a decision, she wanted to think and pray about where best she could be used by God for his purposes. That's the first reason she wanted to delay. But secondly, she wanted to get experience sharing the gospel at home. She figured there's not much sense trying to share the gospel with the remote jungle tribes in Spanish and difficult tribal languages if she hadn't even learned to share the gospel with people in English. And I think that's actually very good wisdom. You can spend 4 or 5 years in Bible college studying a lot of Greek and Bible translation, but not actually be able to disciple someone, to share the gospel with someone, to help them grow in their faith. She wanted to not just have the head knowledge, but also have practical experience. And so in the summer of 1950, she served with the Canadian Sunday School Mission, working in rural Alberta among poor, uneducated, and unevangelized communities. It was hard and often discouraging, which gave her first-hand experience of just how difficult gospel ministry could be. It was great preparation for the mission field. And throughout this time, she started to get a clear picture of where it might be that she would go. She began to see that there was a comparatively large number of missionaries in Africa at the time, while huge swathes of South America were completely unreached. She wrote in her journal, Brazil is the largest unevangelized field in the world. There are Indian tribes far up near the headwaters of the Amazon who have never seen a white face or heard the name of Jesus. How I would love to do some truly pioneer work. In Africa, no mission station is a day's journey from the next. It's not too different from Paul's thinking, actually, when he says, yes, there's so much gospel work to do here, but I want to proclaim the name of Jesus where it's not known at all. We're actually going to look at that passage in more depth tomorrow night. So that was very much her thinking as well. And so as she thought about these many tribes who had never heard about Jesus, she started to set her sights on South America. And so, to prepare herself, she moved to the slums of Brooklyn, New York, where she lived in squalid conditions among Spanish-speaking migrants so that she could start to learn kind of Spanish immersion, if you will. At first, she enjoyed the novelty of the experience. She wrote in her journal, imagine me living in a tenement in Brooklyn, more fun. But here I am in a bed alone in a little flat in the Spanish section. The Lord is here and I am happy. It wasn't long before she began to struggle, though. Her next journal entry reads, lonely. What do missionaries who go to a foreign field who go to a foreign field alone? Here I have friends nearby, but feel so very much alone. I've been cold ever since I got here. There was no heating or water, and the place is so filthy too. Didn't have running water. She wrote to Jim, I do not deny that I'm sometimes lonely here, surrounded entirely by foreigners, with not even a tree to relieve the oppression of filthy walls. All around are typical east side tenements with their rusted fire escapes, broken stone steps, bedding drooling from the windowsills, etc. This building's no exception. The smell of boiled cabbage, rusted steam pipes, and crumbling plaster greets me each time I labour up the 5 flights of dank stairway, utterly removed from anything I have ever known. It was difficult, but she knew that, and that was part of the point. She saw it as part of her preparation for the mission field. She wasn't naive about the fact that being a missionary is hard. And she knew that she wasn't going to magically become a cross-cultural expert and a hardcore disciple maker overnight by flying to another country. And it's true, it's actually an important insight that's important not to overlook. You don't become a missionary simply by hopping on a plane. Or to put it another way, there's no such thing as transformation by aviation. She wrote, I think we prospective missionaries, those who are thinking about the possibility of cross-cultural ministry, we often get a false idea that somehow everything's going to be different on the field, including ourselves. Not so. Granted, there'll be much that's different in our environment and many adjustments necessary. Let's not minimize these. But on the other hand, she's talking about an old lecture that they had together. As old Pike used to say, you're stuck with yourself wherever you go. It's the same sad, sweet, stinking self that we should have to deal with on the mission field. And the more trying the circumstances, the sadder, the sweeter, the more stinking that self. Oh, Jim, what a tremendously serious thing this missionary business is. Now, she's onto something really important here. For those who are planning or even thinking about going into cross-cultural missions or even any kind of ministry in the future, there can often be this idea, even subconsciously, that we'll somehow be different in the future. Yeah, I'm struggling with these sins now, and sure, I'm not growing in godliness the way I want to be now. And look, I might actually not be active in sharing the gospel and helping others know Jesus now, but once I'm a missionary, once I'm a pastor, once I go to Bible college, then it'll be different. But as Elizabeth reminds us, we won't be a different person on the mission field or whatever title that we might have. We're stuck with ourselves, with all our weaknesses, our sins, our character flaws. And the more trying and difficult the situation we find ourselves in, away from the comforts of home, the more those weaknesses and our sins are actually going to be exposed and magnified. And so this is a great reminder for any among us who might be thinking about the possibility of this kind of ministry one day. We don't magically become holy simply by moving to another country. We don't magically become disciple makers by getting on a plane or going to Bible college. And that means if you're thinking about that in the future, my encouragement would be start now. Start growing in holiness. Start looking for ministry opportunities, however simple. Start making disciples now. And I'm so thankful for this. It was about 13 years ago now that my great uncle gave me an extremely important piece of advice. And my great uncle, he was a former missionary to the Congo, to Zaire. And he just found out at the time that I'd enrolled to Bible college, but had 6 months before the academic year would start. And he said to me, Ben, so I think I was 17 at the time, he said, Ben, going to Bible college will not make you a godly man. It will not instill life-giving habits of growing in godliness and love. It will not magically make you grow closer with Jesus. It will not give you a heart for the lost and a passion to share the gospel. He said to me, Ben, if you want to grow in those things, you need to commit to do that yourself and start now. And at the time that he said that, I didn't even realize that I'd been subconsciously thinking that Bible college would just somehow make me a different person. But I realized that he was exactly right. And it's a great encouragement, regardless of what the future might hold. Regardless of where we might find ourselves. The encouragement here from Elizabeth Elliot is to look for opportunities to serve now. To dig into the Bible for ourselves in our quiet times, in our personal reading and study. Memorize the Bible, meditate it, devour it. Find opportunities to serve, volunteer at church, on camps, wherever. Start building that Christ-like character and those habits now. Even once Elizabeth Elliot had years of Bible college under her belt, she still was seeking out these opportunities, and I think she was very wise to do so. Now, during her time of preparation in Brooklyn, she met someone named Doreen Clifford. Doreen was a British missionary who was on furlough and was about to return to the jungles of Ecuador. They had an eye-opening discussion, and this is what Elizabeth wrote about it in her journal. She says, it was very profitable to talk with her and get some idea of conditions there. She gave me much practical advice on what to expect and necessary equipment. But more than that, She told me of the burden she has for the yet untouched Auca tribe. Humanly, it would be impossible for women to do such work. Men have tried and been killed. But she believes the Lord has given her this concern for some purpose, if only to pray. Or perhaps she might be a stepping stone for someone else to go in. She said she felt she should work with someone else if God leads her into the field, and asked me to pray about whether he might want me to go with her. And in God's providence, go with her she would. At the time when she first heard about this Auca tribe, Elizabeth couldn't have known how intertwined her life would become with that feared Auca tribe that she had only just heard of. But just a few months after that conversation, on April 5th, 1953, Elizabeth set sail from New York for Ecuador, a small South American country that just so happened to be the same place that Jim Elliot was heading to. And they arrived there about 2 months apart. Now, initially, they were both based in Quito, the capital, where they stayed for about 6 months of intensive Spanish and preparation for jungle work. But after that time, it wasn't too long before Jim headed out east into the Amazon jungle. So there was a mountain range there, and so as soon as you crossed over, all of this is the Amazon basin, and it suddenly becomes very rural, very undeveloped, very untouched by civilization at the time. Whereas Elizabeth went in the opposite direction to start translation work with tribes in western Ecuador. She headed the other direction. Now, keep in mind, at this stage, they were both intending to continue doing missionary work single, at least until they got a sense of whether or not marriage would be a hindrance in a jungle context. To do ministry in places like Quito would be one thing, but out there in the Amazon, there were very different challenges that people would have to face. But during this time, they kept up frequent correspondence with each other by letter, and after a few months, they started to talk more and more seriously about the possibility that maybe at some point in the future they could get married. In August of 1953, however, disaster struck when the missionary base of Shandia, where Jim Elliot and his colleagues were stationed, was devastated by floods. After heavy rains, the river completely flooded and destroyed all their buildings and wiped out months of work. Out there in the jungle with no tools, nothing. They said that even one plank of wood for a building, planed by hand, would usually take about a day's work for a few men. And they'd slowly built up all these buildings, and then it was all wiped away in one night. With their base destroyed, Jim and a few of his colleagues set off on a 3-week scouting expedition, hiking through the jungle, looking for new opportunities for outreach amongst the Quechua Indians who lived in that area. And during that trip, they met a native man named Atanasio. Atanasio lived in a small clearing called Puyapungu with his 2 wives and 15 children, and he asked the men to come live among his family and establish a school. Now, it's important to know that among the Quechua Indians of that area, missionaries like them had been working for quite a few years. They'd established schools and all this kind of thing, but they'd walked into the jungle a fair way, and they'd never had this kind of opening. A, it was further into the jungle, but B, this was someone who was actually openly inviting them, please send someone, please establish a school here. And so normally they would have to work for years to gain the trust and friendship of the locals, but with this open invitation, they felt that it was too good an opportunity to refuse. But there was a problem: who would go? As they looked at the logistics, one missionary wouldn't be able to go along. They'd need 2 to establish the school. And Jim was keen, and he had a few of his missionary colleagues with him, but due to other responsibilities that they had, none of them could go with him. The other missionaries were needed at other mission stations. And he certainly couldn't take Elizabeth with him since they weren't married, and so it seemed like they were at an impasse. But then Jim came up with a solution. He wrote her a letter and said, "So, how soon will you marry me?" And less than 3 weeks later, on October 8th, 1953, they were married. Here's Elizabeth's description of their wedding. Married without a fuss at the Registro Civil in Quito, civil ceremony, it was a delightfully simple 10 minutes. A dingy, high-ceilinged room in an antique colonial building. A suitably solemn official who read in rapid monotone several pages of Spanish, punctuated here and there by our C. Dr. and Mrs. Tidmarsh, our official witnesses, those are other missionaries, were the only ones present beside the McCulleys. Both couples were also fellow missionaries. We signed our name in an immense ledger and were man and wife. No fancy wedding, no white dress, no big guest list, but after more than 5 years of uncertainty, they were together. They had a quick honeymoon, began to pack their equipment into steel drums and boxes lined with waterproof paper, loaded them into canoes, and then they were off into the jungle. Puyapungu was a long way from any roads and it was only accessible by canoe, and so they loaded up and set off down the river. They eventually arrived at a small thatched house of Adanasio, where he lived with his 2 wives and children and 15 children, and proceeded to get things set up. It was quite a shock, an introduction to married life. Out there, everywhere in the jungle there, the bugs are bad, but on their first night in Puyapungu, she remembered waking up and feeling like something was crawling on her, and they turned on the gas lantern and there were cockroaches crawling all over both of their bodies. Quite an introduction to married life, I reckon. And that's how they spent the first 6 months of their marriage together, deep in the Amazon jungle. Eventually they moved back to the rebuilt mission station at Shandia because opportunities had opened up there again. And they needed a slightly more stable base because their daughter Valerie was born in February of 1955. And Shandia it was still very basic, but had slightly better facilities to be able to care for the newborn baby. Now, it's important to understand that throughout this whole time, Elizabeth and Jim were living among the Quechua people. Now, the Quechua were a peaceful tribe of Ecuadorian natives who lived in the Amazonian jungle. And the Quechua were neighbors to another tribe known as the Aucas, who they greatly feared. So you had the Quechua people, you had another tribe down here, which are the kind of famous head-shrinking tribes. You sometimes hear about head-shrinking, but they actually had missionaries working among them as well. But the Aucas had no one in contact with them. Not just the Western world, even the Quechuas had no contact with the Auca people, and they feared them greatly. They were known for deadly spear attacks on the peaceful Quechua people as well. And they had many decades of bad blood between them. So the Quechua people didn't even go close to Auca territory. Now, the missionary work among the Quechuas was, of course, challenging in a lot of ways, but in God's kindness, it had made real progress. There were a solid number of Quechua believers who had accepted the gospel. A number had learned to read and could now access the parts of the Bible that Jim and Elizabeth and others were steadily translating into Quechua. Jim had even trained a number of the Quechuas to preach and teach, and they were now taking on more and more ownership for taking the gospel to their own people, which was always the explicit goal for both of them. They were there to bring the gospel where it was not yet, so that they could make disciples, train them up to be able to reach their own people more effectively. So the work among the Quechuas was progressing, but it was gnawing on them that still, all this time, the Aucas still had zero access to the gospel. And there was no one who was reaching them. And in fact, no one even knew how to reach them. They knew roughly over that way is Auca territory, but no one had actually ever located or found where any of the Auca settlements were. In the middle of 1955, however, a series of events transpired that made contact with the Aucas seem like a possibility. The first obstacle to overcome was simply finding them. And maybe some people had discovered an Auca settlement, but certainly no one had ever lived to tell the tale. But Nate Saint was a missionary pilot who had been flying over those jungles for years, and up until that point, he had still never spotted them. The jungle was very dense, and even you'll see some of the pictures shortly, and you'll think, oh, it seems pretty easy to see them. But he describes it in his journals. The way that the tall trees were, you could fly right past them and not see them. You had to be directly over top to see through a clearing in the trees. So for years, he'd never spotted any Auca settlements or Auca people. But then, in the middle of 1955, he happened across not one, but two small Auca settlements in the span of just a few weeks. So now they at least knew where they were. But the second obstacle was how to communicate with them. The Aucas spoke a language that was completely different to the neighboring Quechuas. So, once you learn Spanish, that's fine, but the Quechuas couldn't speak Spanish. So you have to learn the local Quechua language, but even that was completely different to the Auca language. But in God's providence, around that same time, Jim and Elizabeth got word of an Auca woman who had fled from her tribe, named Dayuma. Her father had been speared to death in one of the many tribal feuds. Among the Aucas, there are a few groups of them, and they had constant civil wars with each other, spearing each other to death. And so her father had been killed. She managed to escape, but she knew that if she stayed, she'd be killed in one of the cycles of revenge killings that would follow. And so she'd fled and had now been working on a Quechua plantation. And so when they heard about her, Jim and Elizabeth visited Dayuma and began to learn from her some of the basic phrases they could use to communicate with the Aucas. Biti miti una mupa means I like you, I want to be your friend. Biti winki punga umpu means I want to come near you. Awung arimi means what is your name? So they started to write down all these little phrases, as many as they could. So they now found the Aucas, and they could now speak some basic Auca phrases for friendly contact. But the third major obstacle still remained, and that was the biggest one. And that was that no one had ever made face-to-face contact with the Aucas and survived. This history went back quite a few centuries. They were always a very isolated tribe, but a few hundred years prior, there were some people who came in for doing rubber farming and that kind of thing, and brutally treated the Aucas. And so they had a lot of killings back and forth between them, but from that point on, for the next hundreds of years, they wouldn't have any peaceful contact with outsiders. They would always kill anyone they came across. And so this was a huge obstacle in front of them, but they began to work on a plan for how they might overcome it. Nate Saint, the missionary pilot, had pioneered a remarkable new technique for doing airdrops from his plane. Instead of just dropping things with parachutes, now I still don't fully understand how the physics of this works. It's pretty complicated in the way that centrifugal force works and stuff. But basically, they had pioneered a system that allowed them to gently lower a basket from a long rope, a long cable, as the plane flew in tight circles above. So you can see the plane there and a long rope with something hanging off it. And they would get this cable that they could reel out for hundreds and hundreds of meters. Now, as they swung in tighter and tighter circles, the bucket would get in more and more circles until it started hovering over a point, and they could raise and lower it while the bucket stayed almost stationary while the plane flew above. And so someone on the ground could receive a bucket, take things out of it, even put something back in, send it up. They could even use it for, you could put a telephone wire in it, because of course they didn't have wireless telephones back then, but they could have a telephone on one end and connect it so they could talk to someone on the ground. It's quite remarkable. And this was quite important because in looking at how things had been done before, there are times where people had flown over and tried to drop gifts to tribes, and that had some success and started to build some goodwill, but they'd realized that because of course these tribes didn't understand what the plane was, and so there was no way to discern if people were intentionally dropping these gifts, or they weren't sure if they were throwing their spears up they threw their spears up at this plane. Maybe they'd injured it, and it was it was losing things from its belly kind of thing. And so this technique actually allowed them to have control of the gift and give it and take it in a way that would be understood, and was actually understood, as we are making friendly contact with you while from a safe distance. And so using this method, they started to fly over the Auca settlements, giving them gifts. while they would shout through a loudspeaker some of the Alka phrases they'd learned. "We are friends, we like you." Now, the first time they'd done this and flown over with a plane, the Alkas were afraid, loud noise, but quite soon began to react very positively. And they would run out whenever they heard the plane coming, waving and smiling and taking the gifts with delight. The missionaries sent them food, useful things like pots and machetes, and even they took pictures of themselves, which they blew up as big as they could to life size, that they gave them so that they would recognize them face to face. Rather than just thinking that this is this big yellow plane, they would actually know them when they eventually had face-to-face contact. On a few trips, the Alkas even began to send gifts back, tying on a basket for the missionaries to reel in on the flight home. And once when they got back, they opened the basket and found a live parrot, which the Alkas kept as pets and had given to them. And that's one of the good stories. Another one was that the Alkas had given them a few squirrels, but as they came back and landed the plane, the basket didn't land very softly on the runway, and the squirrels weren't alive when they opened the basket. But the parrot was alive, so that's good. And so all of this was what they called Operation Alka. And it was well underway, and they were slowly building friendly contact with the Alkas. This all took place over months. They were very cautious, and they were also very cautious not to give things away. Everything they were doing was over shortwave radio, and so they even had code words. They would call the Alkas, they would just refer to them as our neighbors, and the Alka territory was the neighborhood, and they'd name different settlements, Terminal City, all that kind of thing. So that as they spoke over shortwave radio, other people weren't aware that they were making this, doing this very dangerous contact. So after a few months and much goodwill, and these small, slow planes could fly very low, they could see them, speak to them, exchanging gifts, and after much thought, planning, and prayer, they decided it was time to meet the Alkas face to face. But before we look at that, we're going to have a short break. So I'll invite Rachel up, who will let us know what's going to happen for supper.
I expected a cliffhanger, but not like that. So we're just going to take a break to stretch our legs, have some food, do chat with one another about what we've heard just now, and I will be back with a 5-minute warning. We will start about 8:15. Thanks.
Well, so far we've seen something of Elizabeth Elliot's early years, her preparation for the mission field, and her first years in Ecuador with Jim among the Quechua Indians. We then saw the commencement of Operation Alka, which involved months of flyovers in Alka territory, exchanging of gifts, and friendly interaction. And with all that going well, they were getting a lot of really positive signs that this was a really groundbreaking interaction, the likes of which no one had had before with the Alka tribe. It got to the point where the 5 missionaries began to plan for their first face-to-face contact with the Alkas. It's important to note that this isn't something that they thought lightly of or just went in brashly or willy-nilly. It's something that they prayed hard about, they were very careful about. They took every precaution. They even did things like, Nate Saint, who is the pilot, describes getting a blank gun so it could shoot blanks and make a loud noise. And he felt a lot safer, he said, going into Alka territory having a blank gun because it did 2 things. If things got really hairy, you could fire it off. They wouldn't know any different. And obviously for people who really were living in the equivalent technologically of the Stone Age, the firing of a gun was a very scary thing. Loud bang and then someone dies. They've had bad interactions with people before. But so having the blanks, he knew that there'd be no risk of him actually hurting them because no matter what, we don't want to hurt them, but it might just make them feel a little bit safer if something did get hairy. So there's all kinds of precautions that they were taking. So as they started to have really positive encounters with them, they kept praying, the 5 men and their wives, and they decided together, yes, the time seemed right to plan their first face-to-face contact. How to do so, especially because it was days and days from the nearest settlement hike into the jungle before you could even get to where the Aucas were. And remember, this is very dense forest, so how would you even be able to get in close? It's one thing to fly a plane over, but how would you actually get in there on the ground? Well, during the flyovers, they scanned the area, searching long and far for a place where they might be able to land their small little plane. And they eventually spotted a strip of sand by the river that was just big enough to land a plane. And it was only a few hours' walk from the Auca settlements. It was very risky. It was narrow on a curved part of the river. And they set up a system where they could fly over and drop at a certain speed, and then they would drop bits of flour at intervals so that they could gauge the distance, because it's very hard to gauge the distance from the air. And so they figured, okay, it looks like we've got a long enough airstrip that they might be able to land in close. What they did then, once they'd found that, is after a few weeks of planning, they flew in and set up camp and waited. And these are pictures that they themselves took as Nate Tate would fly in and drop supplies. It took a few trips because they had to have the plane very light to be able to get in and out. That's the little sand strip going past them where they landed, and they set up camp. They set things up so that they very high. They had a tree house up in the trees so that they wouldn't get ambushed at night if anything bad happened. And this is really important. They didn't want to just walk into the Auca village because they thought that would be seen as too aggressive. So what they do is they fly in, set up camp nearby, and then do more and more flyovers and tell them, we're nearby, come visit us, we're friends, keep dropping them gifts. And so they did that, and then sure enough, after a few days of waiting, and then they would stand there in this camp and they would wade into the river with their little book of phrases and just call out into the jungle, because they didn't know where people, if the Aucas might be getting close or not. We're your friends, we're your friends. They would just shout for hours into the jungle, not knowing if anyone was there. And eventually, after a few days, 3 Aucas appeared at their camp. They couldn't understand each other, but they spent hours together, and it was all very friendly. They shared food, which the Aucas loved, and they'd even made a little airplane, which the Aucas were very interested in, and they did little demonstrations, and the Aucas were loving it. And so they spent a whole day together trying to speak little phrases, and as the day drew to a close, the Aucas left and headed off for home. And the missionaries couldn't believe it. This was the first friendly contact with the Aucas in recorded history, even by other Native American tribes there. They'd taken pictures and even video during the day, which is of course what you're seeing there, and they wrote about the encounter in their journals. This is what they'd been praying and planning towards for months. They used the plane's radio to report back home, and the 5 wives were relieved to hear how things were going. But it was still a tense time, as you can imagine. And Elizabeth looked forward to the radio updates that would come in at 3-hourly intervals that would fill them in. So they had a great day of first contact with the Aucas, and the following day was a bit of an anticlimax. There was no Auca visit. But the following day, January 8th, 1956, while Nate Tate was on a scouting trip, he spotted a bunch of Aucas who were walking towards the camp. So he radioed in and said, "Hey guys, they're going to visit again. This is very exciting." So he let them back, radioed in home base to let the home base know that they were expecting another visit, and that he would radio in later that afternoon in 3 hours to let them know how the second visit went. You can imagine how scary it would have been. Elizabeth was anxiously waiting on the radio for it to come through at the scheduled time, and when they got to the scheduled time, nothing came through on the radio. Still nothing overnight. And so the next day, the reserve pilot, Johnny Keenan, flew out to see if he could find out what happened. He could see the plane on the beach, but it had been stripped of its fabric, and there was no sign of the men. He reported this back to the wives, and they spoke to a fellow missionary pilot who insisted that they contact the United States Air Rescue Service in Panama right away. The missing men made international headlines, as military personnel, journalists, and other missionaries poured into Ecuador to see what they could do to help. Search parties were formed and went out into the jungle for the 3-day hike, while planes continued to search overhead. When search parties reached the strip of sand, they found the empty plane, and over the next few days, they found the bodies of the 5 young missionaries which had been thrown into the river. Some of the bodies still had spears through them, so there's no doubt how they had died. They had met their end in an ambush at the hand of the Aucas who visited their camp on January 8th, 1956. They'd had very little understanding, even for days afterwards, of what had actually happened. And so Elizabeth and the other wives were already fearing the worst, but when the confirmation finally came from the search party, a military officer gathered them together to share all the information that they had. And by the time they found the bodies, they weren't actually able to identify them except by their wedding rings and watches that they had. Their deaths were a great tragedy. The 5 young men, 5 young missionaries who died, including Jim Elliot, Nate Sate, the pilot, and 3 others, were aged between 27 and 32. They left behind 5 wives and 9 children, one of which was born just a few weeks after his father's death. They would never meet. As news broke, there were people who questioned whether the men were being irresponsible by taking such risks while they had young families to care for. But the wives knew the risks as well as their husbands. And in fact, the 5 of them had gathered, the 5 wives had gathered one night a few weeks before that Auca encounter to discuss the possibility that their husbands might die trying to reach them. Elizabeth writes this: "The other wives and I talked together one night about the possibility of becoming widows. What would we do? God gave us peace of heart and confidence that whatever might happen, His word would hold. Each of us knew when we married our husbands that there would never be any question about who came first. God and His work held first place in each life. It was the condition of true discipleship." Jesus saying, "Take up your cross and follow me." It became devastatingly meaningful now. It was a time for soul searching, a time for counting the possible cost. Was it the thrill of adventure that drew our husbands on? No, their letters and journals make abundantly clear that these men did not go out as some men go out, to shoot a lion or climb a mountain. Their compulsion was from a different source. Each had made a personal transaction with God, recognizing that he belonged to God, first of all by creation, and secondly through redemption by the death of his Son, Jesus Christ. This double claim on his life settled once and for all the question of allegiance. To these men, Jesus Christ was God and had taken upon himself human form in order that he might die. And by his death, not only provide escape from the punishment which their sin merited, but also a new kind of life, eternal, both in length and in quality. This meant simply that Christ was to be obeyed. And more than that, that he would provide the power to obey. The point of decision had been reached. God's command, go and preach the gospel to every creature, was the categorical imperative. The question of personal safety was wholly irrelevant. These 5 missionary women, just like their husbands, were committed to taking the gospel to those who didn't know it, even in the face of very real risks. Not out of a sense of adventure, but because they knew that eternity was at stake. Every Auca who died without a chance to hear the gospel would justly receive the punishment for the way they had lived. And make no mistake about the noble savage, what about that good, innocent tribesperson who's never heard? There is no such thing. Such a person does not exist, the innocent tribesperson. All of us are sinful before God. We all deserve God's condemnation, justly. The Bible is clear that all are without excuse before God and must face his eternal judgment. So for the Alkers, they had no way of access to the life-giving message of Jesus, that he died for our sins to open up the way so that we could be reconciled to God. Every Alker who died didn't have access to Jesus, and yet for every missionary who died trying to reach them, they had this security that not even death could snatch them away from their Heavenly Father's loving arms. When they traveled to that strip of sand to set up camp and wait for the Alkers, the 5 men had brought a few guns along with them for protection against predators and dangers of the jungle. There's a lot of animals that could kill you out there. So they were armed when they were attacked by men with wooden spears. If they had wanted to defend themselves, they could have easily done so. But they had decided no matter what, and they had made this pact with each other, even if they were attacked by the Alkers, they would not use guns to fight back or defend themselves. Because if it came down to a question of kill or be killed, the decision was clear. As they put it, we are ready for heaven. The Alkers are not. The deaths of these 5 young men seemed all the more tragic because it seemed to come out of nowhere. Why, after the initial friendly contact, did the Alkers suddenly attack and kill them? For a long time, after their deaths, that question remained a mystery, and there was no way of knowing. But years later, it was discovered that one of the men from the initial visit had gotten into an unrelated dispute with other members of the tribe that next day, and they wanted to kill him, as Alkers often did. It was a very brutal situation where they were often killing each other, even over small disagreements. And so to deflect blame away from himself, the Alka man who had visited them actually lied to his tribe and told them that the white men were plotting to harm them, even though he knew that they weren't. And so based on this lie, and out of a genuine fear that the missionaries intended them harm, the tribe decided to strike first and kill the 5 men. That's the group of people that Nate Saint saw walking towards them. So years later, Elizabeth wrote, basically it was fear that led them to what they now regard as a mistake. But we know that it was no accident. God performs all things according to the counsel of his will. The real issues at stake on January 8th, 1956 were far greater than those which immediately involved 5 young men and their families, or this small tribe of naked savages. Letters from many countries have told of God's dealings with hundreds of men and women through the examples of 5 who believed literally that the world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. 1 John 2:17. The 5 men believed that. They really did. They took God at his word. This world is temporary. They believe that heaven and hell are real and that eternity is a long time. They took Jesus at his word when he promised that whoever believes in him will live forever, and that whoever doesn't believe in Jesus will perish. They took Jesus at his word and chose to shape their lives around those eternal realities. You know, Nate Saint wrote a few years before they went in. Keep in mind, this is 1950s, and so World War II was in recent memory for a lot of them. In fact, Roger Udarian, one of the 5 men, had actually been a paratrooper who was decorated for fighting in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II and had later gone on to be a missionary. And Nate Saint had written how struck he was that so often people would say to him, "What are you guys doing taking these risks? Going out to share the gospel with these people in these difficult places. Are you sure it's wise? Shouldn't you be more careful?" And he said, "We've just come out of World War II, where America said, 'Come, risk your lives, be willing to be seen as expendable for a greater cause.' And people by their thousands and hundreds of thousands were willing to lay down their lives for that cause. And Nate Saint said, we as Christians are commissioned by Jesus, have such a greater cause to lay our lives down for. And yet when Jesus tells us, go into the world and make disciples of all nations, we say, oh, it's too risky. Or it might be a bit difficult. Oh, but what about the culture barrier? That might be hard on my family. I find this really challenging. There are so many people even today who go to all kinds of difficult parts of the world for oil exploration and for money. We have a far greater cause to give our lives for. And yet, half the world's population, even today, 70 years after these events, remain unreached with the gospel. People like the Alkas who have no one in their country and their culture who can share the gospel with them. Who will go? At the time, the news of their deaths made international headlines, and there were many who saw it as a senseless waste of life. 5 brilliant young men with promising futures. 5 men with young families who threw it all away for nothing. And do you know what? If this world is all that there is, then those people are right. It was a senseless, pointless waste of life. But if this world is not all there is, if Jesus is right, and if this world and its desires pass away, but those who do the will of God live forever, then their deaths were not a waste. In 1949, 7 years before the attack, while Jim Elliot was still in college, a young uni student, he wrote these words in his journal. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. He's no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. You see, we cannot keep the things of this fading world or take them with us into eternity. Our jobs, our houses, our share portfolios, our reputation, even our very life on this earth, we can't keep it. We're all going to die eventually. Nate Saint said another time, he's like, if I go there, I might die and get eaten by cannibals. But if I stay here, I'm going to die and get eaten by worms one day anyway. So why not be willing to give these things up? Our possessions, our money, our time, yes, even our life, to gain things that can never be taken away. Eternal treasure, souls won for Jesus, a reward that we cannot lose for all eternity. That's not just a noble thing to do. Doesn't it just make sense? Isn't that a far better investment of our time and our resources and our lives? So I wonder, what might it look like for you and me to follow the example of these 5 women and these 5 men who were taking God at his word and living in light of these truths, these eternal realities? I mean, if you're anything like me, none of this is new information. I know this stuff. Heaven, hell, eternity. But so often it fails to shape my priorities. And so often we end up spending our lives for the things of this world. Spending our money to make this short life a little bit more comfortable. Working for what we cannot keep. Looking to what will not last. Hebrews 13 tells us to remember those who have gone before us and to consider the outcome of their way of life. To follow their example as they followed the example of Christ. So what might it look like for you and me to follow their example and set our priorities in light of eternity? It doesn't just have to mean going overseas to live in a jungle. How do those eternal priorities affect the way we spend our money, the way we spend our time, the way we think about our career, our house, where we live, what we teach our children, what we model to them is important. What energizes us, what we love, what we care about. What would it look like for the death and resurrection of Jesus and the eternal realities that flow out from those to set the agenda for every part of your life in the next month, in the next year, in the next decade? A big part of having a missions month each year, we want to put it on the radar so that we will pray for those who are going across cultures with the gospel, so that we will give to support them, but also that some of us will go. It won't be all of us, it can't be, but it must be some of us. Could it be you? If not, why not? Are you one of those people who might go to those in other cultures who don't yet have access to the gospel in the way we have here in Australia? You know, it's true, there is so much work to be done even here. There is so much need here in Perth. But even those who don't yet know Jesus at least have access to the gospel. I met a guy just last year. He graduated from UWA, went to work as a software engineer. He was a staunch atheist. He watched some Jordan Peterson videos. He decided, look, just in terms of understanding Western culture, I should read the Bible just to understand it from an intellectual point of view. He gets up to Matthew's gospel and then John's gospel. He gets converted on the spot in his bedroom, on his own. So what does he do? Because he had access to the Bible, of course. What does he do? He Googles churches nearby him. He's now going to Vic Park Presbyterian Church and has been growing in his faith ever since. Yes, there's a lot of need here in Perth, but God can save people like that. And when they're saved here, there are so many good Bible teaching churches they can go to. Whereas so many other parts of the world, they don't have that. So yes, we have need here in Perth as well, but there is such a stark need in other places. If that could be you, if that's even on the radar as a possibility that you might be one of those who could go, whether as a full-time missionary or Bible translator, or even to use your secular vocation as an engineer or a teacher, that could take you to parts of the Middle East or Asia where Bible college graduates can't even go. There are a lot of people who use their engineering degree to go and share the gospel in a country that's closed to the gospel. Could that be you? If that's on the radar, please chat to one of your pastors here, and they would love to think with you and pray with you and chat with you about what that might look like. But for all of us, living in light of eternity isn't limited to being on the mission field across cultures. We can hold the ropes for those who go. We can be active in the spread of the gospel here at home. We can be praying for and financially supporting the work of the gospel. We can be allowing Jesus' death and resurrection to be the driving factor behind all that we do in life. We can strive for wartime simplicity, saying, no, I don't need that new car. I don't need that bigger house. I don't actually need that renovation. Why don't I give that money for the cause of the gospel? To invest it in something to give up what you cannot take with you anyway, to gain something you cannot lose, and you'll be able to rejoice in for all eternity to come. As the Lord Jesus promised, whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. Give thy sons to bear the message glorious. Give of thy wealth to speed them on their way. Pour out thy souls for them in prayer victorious. And all thou spendest, Jesus will repay. The deaths of these 5 young missionaries was a real tragedy, but in so many ways it was not the end of the story. Although Jim was now dead, Elizabeth Elliot decided to remain with 10-month-old Valerie at the mission station Chandia and continue the work there. She records in her journal that the last time she saw Jim alive, as he'd walked onto that plane, she'd asked him, "What shall I do if you don't come back?" And he'd answered her, "Teach the believers, darling. Teach the believers." Those were the last words he spoke to her. And that's exactly what she did as she continued among the believers, the Quechua Indians at Chandia, to disciple them and build them up. She writes, "There was much maintenance work to oversee on the station, the clearing of weeds on the airstrip, the planting of pineapples and bananas to give them sustenance, the constant work to keep the jungle back from the trails and clearings, the mending of fences and thatched roofs, the finishing of a school building which Jim had started, beside the ordinary work of living without many conveniences." You can imagine how many hours of a day it took just to get the laundry done, just to cook food, and everything had to be done manually. I had a baby to care for, medical work to do among the Indians, a girls' school to teach, the translation of the Quechua scriptures to do, a Bible class in the boys' school to prepare for, and the shepherding of a young group of Quechua Christians. A lot to do. And with a 10-month-old. And on her own. And so in circumstances more difficult than we can probably imagine, for the next 2 years she continued her work amongst the Quechuas. But there was a big part of her that longed to reach the Aucas with the gospel still, and she prayed for them regularly. People often thought, and they had conversations with her, they presumed that she would be angry at the Aucas, but the opposite was true. She said she often had to explain. The fact that Jesus Christ died for all makes me interested in the salvation of all. But the fact that Jim loved and died for the Aucas intensifies my love for them. She longed to reach the Aucas with the gospel, but she knew it would take some kind of miracle. And then in November 1957, about 2 years after Jim's death, Elizabeth heard news that made her heart jump. 2 Auca women had just walked out of the jungle and had come to a Quechua village just a few hours' walk from where she was. She packed a few things in her bag. She left Valerie with someone who could take care of her, and she set off immediately on foot. When she arrived, she found that the 2 Auca women had been dressed by the Quechuas. You can see them there. But she instantly recognized one of them from the photos that had been taken on that little sand strip. One of those 2 women who had visited Jim and the other 4 missionaries at that first friendly encounter. Due to the language barrier, no one had any idea why the Auca women had come or how long they would stay. And the Quechuas were extremely worried. They were worried this was a trap. At one point, the Auca women began to sing, and after the chanting had continued for a while, someone cried out, one of the Quechua Indians cried out, "She's casting a spell on us." And someone else shouted that they're signaling for the men to ambush us. It turns out it had just been an innocent song, but everyone was so on edge. The Auca people were so feared. It was a tense couple of days, and the Quechua men slept with their guns and posted guards throughout the night. But as the days went by, people started to calm down. About a week later, though, Elizabeth and Valerie were bathing in the river with the 2 Auca women when they heard a shout from the house across the river. "Aucas, they've attacked." The Quechua men ran over with shotguns and found that one of their friends had been ambushed. His body was riddled with 18 spears. Elizabeth realized they needed to move back to the relative safety of Chandia, and the Auca women seemed happy to come with her. And so over the next 10 months, Elizabeth lived with the women and slowly studied their language, slowly started to learn it from them, word by word. She soon discovered that the 2 women were aunts of Dayuma, the girl who had fled from the Aucas many years earlier, and who had since become a Christian. Then one day, they'd begun to understand each other a little bit more. The two Alka women said to Elizabeth, in their language of course, they said, "We promised our family that when the palm fruit is ripe, we would go home, back to the Alkas, and we want you to come with us." Elizabeth was shocked, and she asked them, "Do you think your people will spear me like they speared my husband?" The two Alka women laughed and said, "Of course not, you're our friend." She didn't quite know how to read that though, understandably. It still felt extremely risky. Remember before, they'd had a lot of positive contact, but then it had all turned sour in a moment. She spoke to friends and family to ask what they thought, and they strongly discouraged her from going. They said, "It's pointless, it's too dangerous. You know how it's going to end if you go." This wouldn't be the first time that the Alkas appeared friendly, only for things to go south quickly. But Elizabeth knew that no outsider had ever been invited in by the Alkas before, and that this might be the opportunity to bring them the gospel that she had been waiting for. And so after much prayer, Elizabeth decided that she would go. She packed up a few belongings, loaded up 2-year-old Valerie on a wooden chair on the back of a Quechua man carrying her, and they began the 3-day hike into Alka territory. It was a tense journey, but the Alka women were true to their word, and they made sure that the tribe treated her as a friend. In addition to the two women, they were also accompanied by Dayuma, the Christian Alka, who had lived outside the tribe now for years and years, who had escaped when her father was killed. But also they were joined by Rachel Saint, the sister of the missionary pilot Nate Saint, who had died on the beach with Jim. And over the next 2 years, Elizabeth and little Valerie lived with the Alkas, gained their trust, and learned more of their language. While Elizabeth was still struggling to put sentences together in the difficult language, Dayuma, who had come with them, was busily sharing the gospel with her people week after week. Slowly, some of the Alkas became Christians, including 2 of the men who had speared the 5 missionaries a few years earlier. Eventually, for a whole host of reasons that you can read more about if you check out one of the biographies about Elizabeth Elliot, it was decided that it would be best for her and Valerie to move back to Shandia to continue the work there with the Quechua Indians, while Rachel Saint stayed with the Alkas for a time. And then after another 2 years, they returned home to the United States in 1963. We certainly don't have time tonight for a full account of Elizabeth's life, but she went on to become a prolific author and speaker, challenging many to give their lives to the mission field. She'd already written her first book just 6 months after Jim's death, called Through Gates of Splendor, detailing the events leading up to the 5 men being killed. She would go on to write more than 20 other books as well. She was diagnosed with dementia in 1999 and died in 2015 at the age of 88. Elizabeth Elliot led a remarkable life and left a lasting legacy. The Alkas, now known as the Waranis, were among the many who have been impacted by her life. By 1958, the time when they made contact, and Elizabeth Elliot went to live with them, their population as a whole, all of the Alkas together, had dwindled down to barely 600 people left. Due to the constant cycles of revenge killing, they were close to driving themselves to extinction. Anthropologists think that if they had been left another 5 or 10 years, they probably would all been dead, because they would not be able to have enough to increase their population again. But when Elizabeth went to live among them and Dayuma began to share the gospel with them, their homicide rate dropped by 90% overnight. They had never seen someone not want to take revenge when their family member had been killed. And once they realized that here was the woman who they had speared to death 2 years earlier, and she came in and instead of seeking revenge, offered them forgiveness, that opened their eyes to a different way of doing things. And it transformed the tribe. Now, due to fewer tribal killings and greater access to medicine, their tribe has grown to almost 2,000, and today about a third of them are Christians. Now, make no mistake, Elizabeth was not perfect. She's no saint. She would be the first to admit that she was a struggling sinner just like the rest of us. But our hope tonight is that by remembering her and considering the outcome of her way of life, we might be encouraged to follow her example and therefore follow Jesus more closely. In January of 1951, a year before she left for Ecuador, Elizabeth wrote the following entry in her journal. Since I last wrote, I've read the biography of Frances Ridley Havergal. It did what other Christian biographies have done, deepened my hunger for knowing Christ in his fullness, for living wholly unto him who died for us. I'm impressed always upon reading of someone who lived a holy life with the reflection, what would be written of me were I to die today? God alone knows how very, very little I know of true holiness, Christ-likeness, and Calvary love. That was the year before she left for Ecuador. And I find it fascinating to read that even for Elizabeth herself, biographies of Christians from the past were a great source of encouragement to her. They deepened her hunger for knowing Christ and for living wholly for him who died for us. And so to close tonight, let me commend to you the habit of reading Christian biography. There are so many available. You can even get them on audiobook, so you can listen to them while you commute to work or while you do chores around the house. Avail yourself of this rich resource of encouragement that God has given us in the lives of those who have gone before us. If you don't know where to start, grab a copy of Through Gates of Splendor, and I guarantee that you'll find it encouraging, inspiring, and challenging. We've only been able to touch on a few snippets, but there's so much more to the story. Hebrews 13 says, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The same Jesus who worked so powerfully through them is the same Jesus who is still at work through his people and by his Spirit. It's not like God used to work in powerful ways back then, but now things are much more ordinary. No, God is still at work in the same ways, and he still calls us to surrender our lives to him just as wholeheartedly. So let's fix our eyes on Jesus. Let's deny ourselves and pick up our cross and follow him. And let's each play our part in God's global mission for the spread of the gospel, knowing that whatever the cost, he is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Would you pray with me? Gracious Father, we thank you for your unwavering goodness to us. Thank you that through Jesus' death and resurrection, we can look forward to eternity with you. Father, help us to live lives now in light of that eternal reality. Father, keep us from being blinded by the idols of comfort and temporary ease. Enthrall us with your Son, Jesus. Open our eyes to see his glory and goodness. Open our eyes to the eternal plight of those who don't yet know him. Father, would you use us to bring the gospel to those who haven't heard? We thank you for the faithful women, the faithful women and men who have gone before us, imperfect sinners, saved by your grace, whose example encourages us to follow Jesus more closely. Father, deepen our hunger for knowing Christ in his fullness and for living wholly for him who died for us. Amen.
Thanks, Ben. Venter has said tonight that he's ready to get on a plane and go, hearing of the need But maybe the first step is reading a mission biography, and it just occurred to me that we have a library here and they have been open for the last month. So do go tomorrow and see the books that they have. I'm pretty sure I did see one on Elizabeth Elliot there. So that would be a great start. Val has also kindly offered, she has just a 30-minute documentary here on more of the life of Jim Elliot, so do see her if you want to loan that one. And would you join me in thanking Ben for being here tonight? And I'll see you all at church tomorrow. Thanks.